Welcome, Nick.
Hello.
Hello, thanks so much for that very warm welcome, Ashton and Hen.
Thanks for being with us.
It's a pleasure to have you on today. Thanks so much for joining us, Nick. Um, can you maybe start by telling us a bit more about your role as a social psychologist and what that specifically involves?
Well, social psychology is, I think, the most fascinating part of psychology. I mean, psychology is a broad field. And so there are some of us who study brains and some of us who study perception and some of us who study language and some of us who study all sorts of things. But social psychologists focus on the fact that humans are social beings. And so we look at things like how do groups function, how do stereotypes work, or what's the basis of prejudices, how do close relationships operate or fail to operate. Just really trying to wrestle with the wonderful complexity of human interaction.
Mm. That sounds fascinating, and also like there would just be endless material.
There is, and I think one of the great things about it as a field is that really, I might have a PhD in it, but we're all social psychologists. All humans are just fascinated with one another. There's nothing more fascinating really than other people, I think. And if anything, the isolation that a lot of us have been experiencing recently just brings that home, how important social connection is. But we all have our theories, we all have our ideas, we're all constantly trying to form impressions of one another and understand other people, and that's what we just try to study using the scientific method.
Fantastic, and I suppose, that would, under different circumstances, what we know about or what conclusions you come to or research findings you have probably get completely upended, or things are challenged all the time, so it'll be never a dull moment with seeing how people behave socially.
Absolutely, and there's so much complexity, and of course it varies by culture, and so a lot of what might have been found in decades of research in North America just doesn't translate very well when you go to other parts of the world, and so we're sort of rediscovering how a lot of what we thought was true about people in general is actually quite situated. And new theories come along and new findings come along and old findings don't replicate. So it's I think, a fascinating field. It's not so fascinating if you need to have your truths absolute and timeless, because people aren't like that. But if you don't mind a bit of ambiguity and a bit of slipperiness, then it's a great field.
Definitely. And so following on from that, we wanted to talk a bit today about one of our exhibits that we've had in the museum, and also I think we have had it touring for other events as well, and also it's hosted online on our website at the moment, which is the compliment booth, which involves visitors receiving a compliment at the press of a button. So from your observations and from just your thinking in social psychology, what kind of effect can giving or receiving compliments have on a person's well-being?
Well, I think it's generally good. I mean, you probably don't need a psychologist to tell you that it feels good when someone sincerely points out something good about yourself. I mean, social rewards matter at least as much as financial rewards to most of us. And so receiving sort of praise, recognition makes us, in the short term, generally speaking, and then there are exceptions which I'll mention, feel quite positive. It boosts our self-esteem, because self-esteem ultimately comes down to how we think we're perceived by others. And so if others give us some positive feedback, we tend to accept it. But it also, I think, just it goes beyond just a momentary boost in cheerfulness. It also makes you more likely to reciprocate with others, to feel bonded to others, to do good to others, to pay things forward. So I think compliments are great. And I think if I could go to a booth and don't even have to pay for a compliment, I just press a button and it comes out. That sounds like a wonderful thing to do. And I'm sort of surprised that your university hasn't monetized it in some way, because surely there'd be a paying audience for well-crafted compliments. And I'm joking, of course, but that doesn't always happen, of course. So if it's a completely over-the-top or sarcastic compliment, or if it's an inauthentic compliment in some way, we all know people who try to, what's the words? Be a bit sleazy in their compliments, or make compliments which are clearly just meant to butter you up rather than, or to have some sort of influence on you rather than genuinely being meant, those don't feel so good. And also, I think if a compliment is genuine and positive, if you don't think very highly of yourself, often it doesn't feel so good either, even if it's meant with full sincerity by the person who gives it to you. Because if you have a negative view of yourself, if you think you're actually not such a wonderful person, then what you're hearing just doesn't fit with your self-image. And people often reject or feel awkward around compliments if they don't match how they see themselves. And that's awkward, because if someone rejects a compliment or sort of or sort of acts as if the compliment you just gave them isn't true, it's sort of like rejecting a gift. It's sort of like, someone gave you this nice gift and you're saying, actually, no, you deserve this gift more. I don't deserve that gift. Compliments can go wrong.
Absolutely. And I think this, coming back to the compliment booth in the gallery, and kind of Ashton and I and the other moderators have had lots of experiences kind of, getting a dose of social psychology, kind of looking at how people interact with this particular exhibit and seeing how people respond to having a screen with a stranger, giving you a compliment. Some people might, feel like that's really lovely, but then there is that element of authenticity, or things not being authentic, or being being warranted, and whether people believe that, and that can make people feel like worse, or make them feel confused by the context surrounding it. So it's definitely I don't know, Ashton, if you have anything.
Yeah, I was surprised actually when we had the compliment booth in the gallery. I was surprised by how well it was received, because when we were learning about it, we always do a briefing before the exhibition opens. And I remember thinking, well, going into a booth and pressing a button and knowing someone's going to say something nice, and it's this running video of different people giving compliments. But actually, in action, it was quite lovely. And I found myself, when I was on shifts, if I needed a bit of a boost, I would sometimes sneak into the compliment booth and press the button and be told, you're doing a good job, or, whatever the random compliment was. And depending on what was happening in your day, it could be quite a nice way of cutting through the noise. But I think my favorite response I saw to the compliment booth was because there was a little curtain that you pulled across. And I was just going through kind of cleaning the galleries and pulled the curtain back because I thought no one was in there. And someone was standing there holding a baby up. And the baby was receiving all of these compliments. And the one I heard the baby receive, it was something like, I really appreciate the contributions you give. And I thought, what a nice thing for a baby to hear. But it's interesting what you were saying before, Nick, about the discomfort sometimes that can come from receiving compliments. Because I know that for me growing up, and I think it's that Australian tall poppy syndrome stuff, it was really ingrained in primary school from my friends and peers that if you got a compliment, you needed to deflect it or make a joke about yourself. And even now in my 30s, I'm only just getting used to when someone gives me a compliment saying, thank you. And it feels very uncomfortable because I think we are trained not to accept compliments. Yeah.
Quite right. And using the word deflection is great. That's a really good choice of words, because I think you're right. I mean, if you're complimented, it's as if against your will, you've been lifted up above the parapet. And we're not, as you say, the whole tall poppy thing, which, by the way, was invented by an Adelaide-based social psychologist.
Really?
Norman Feather. Yeah, he's the expert on the tall poppy syndrome. It is attracting attention to you, and it's attracting positive attention, which, if you're in a society which at least at some level values leveling and not putting yourself above others, you're vulnerable. And I think so what people do when they deflect is an attempt to get back down to the level. And as you say, from the point of view of the person giving the compliment, that's actually a bit of a downer, because you actually say, you deserve positive attention. I'm giving you positive attention, and you're sort of shrinking from it like I've given you an insult. And I think there is something about the culture. There's something about a leveling egalitarian culture. And I know it's not perfectly egalitarian by any standards, but we value equality even if we don't always enact it. that if you receive a compliment, you have to either just deflect or say something humble, or say, no, it wasn't me, it was a team effort. You know, whenever someone does something amazing in the sporting arena, they always have to say, no, it had nothing to do with me at all, it was the team. It's all a way of just trying to sort of escape left, after receiving that positive attention, and it's not ideal, because I think, as you say, sometimes just saying, you meant this as a compliment and I'm grateful for it. Thank you. Humble gratitude is the right response, I think, in most cases. And likewise, another way people deflect sometimes is just simply paying it straight back to the person. So it's a way of just, it's reciprocal, which is nice. But it's also saying, no, I don't want the attention on me. I'm going to give it back to you. And really, no, just sit there, take it, accept it in the spirit it was given. And unless you sort of, go full narcissist about it, people aren't going to really be upset about you.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. I've definitely been a compliment giver who's then had the compliment awkwardly thrust back. And it's just kind of uncomfortable for everyone, because you feel like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said anything, but they did a really great job and I wanted to let them know. So it can be an interesting dance.
Yeah, and I think a dance is, again, another great way of saying it. I think there possibly is a sort of vicious cycle going on here. If people tend to reject or feel awkward around compliments, we give fewer of them. And you'd actually want a world where there's more compliments, at least more authentic ones, and they're not hard to give. It's so easy, and yet these things are sort of rare, and that's why you maybe need a machine. So I think life would be a little bit better if we made occasional random compliments of people, and if they just accepted them. But as long as people don't accept them wholeheartedly, or as long as it sort of creates social awkwardness, people are going to be less likely to give and receive.
Absolutely. Now, this is veering off slightly, but we have a couple of audience questions for you. And these, I guess, fit more in the kind of social psychology and also some of your work about dehumanization as well. So the first one is, what is your take on the current lockdowns of public housing in Victoria, which is disproportionately impacting people from refugee backgrounds?
Yeah, well, that's a really tough one, and I don't know the facts on the ground, although I can think just about see the buildings in question from my office. Look, I think there's two sides to this. I mean, there's the one public health side where I gather the truth is that there are about 53 confirmed cases within some of these buildings, and we do know that lockdowns help and prevent spread. So I think there's nothing in principle wrong with having a lockdown. I think the sort of force first, police enforcement style of operating, and the maybe somewhat disorganized provision of culturally appropriate food and things like that's not great. Having said that, again, I think we should show a little bit of understanding to the people, the public health officials who are, trying to get a response together and maybe not doing it quite right. I've got sort of more annoyance with the people who pile on and say just unnecessarily stigmatizing things about the residents of those blocks. So there's been some unhelpful contributions saying they're all addicts, they're all heavy drinkers, and treating people essentially as being society's refuse, and that's not desirable. So I think you can totally understand. I don't think it's an out of proportion response to do a lockdown. I think we've yet to see some similar thing happen in a rich upmarket apartment block. That's possibly because there just haven't been outbreaks there yet. But some of the way in which it's been handled and some of the unnecessary rhetoric around this has been really unfortunate.
Absolutely. And along those lines, we've had another question come through. How can you imagine those residents would be at risk? So I guess thinking in terms of mental health. Yes, mental health wise. I've just finished the question.
Yeah, look, I think confinement's not good for anyone. I mean, people need people. And, so I think anything that interacts anything that detracts from people's capacity to interact with one another freely is disturbing. So if you're locked up in a rather small, pokey flat, and you would normally be going down to the coffee shop to meet your friends, and now you can't do that, that hurts. I mean, simply being out in the fresh air is a good thing, and getting some exercise. We all know that's beneficial. You know, I think the mental health side of it, I think, is one side, and there's a lot of good evidence that people do, especially in the shorter term, get on average, you know, fairly anxious and miserable when they're in lockdown. You don't need you don't need a psychologist to tell you that. It's not rocket science. But I think there's also, of course, you know, the issue of being confined in a small place creates a lot of, you know, it increases the likelihood of domestic violence as well in all parts of our cities, you know, not just in housing commission flats, of course. So, you know, you worry not just about the sort of mental health aspects of individual anxiety, individual depression, and things like that, and suicidal thoughts. You also, I think, worry about people lashing out, people's frustrations coming to a boil and taking it out on loved ones.
Absolutely. We were chatting just last week with a game designer called Susanna Emery, who's creating a game for her PhD called Hannah, which is looking at domestic violence, because it's always been incredibly prevalent here, but with lockdown, it's definitely something that's increasing. And I think people are more open to discussing it on the media, like in media now and socially. So it's a really, really difficult one, but it's great that people are talking about it more openly now.
Well, and I think that the evidence that I'm aware of suggests that's actually potentially more of a problem in terms of just the amount of suffering caused than mental ill health. So people might jump on me for saying this, but I think in the vast majority of cases, people's responses to lockdown are more negative emotion. But negative emotion is not mental ill health. You know, that's not psychiatric. I mean, it's an understandable, reasonable, rational response to very difficult, trying circumstances, but it's not necessarily mental ill health. Whereas being assaulted is very serious. And I think in some ways, the risk of interpersonal violence and family violence is maybe more dire in much of what we've been witnessing with lockdowns and the like than the risk of increased mental ill health. And I just think it's really important. Occasionally, I sort of worry that we increasingly are defining any sort of a negative emotional state as if that's mental ill health. It isn't. A lot of negative emotions are reasonable, rational, transient responses to difficult, adverse circumstances. The fact that you're anxious about COVID right now is not a mental disorder. It's a fact.
Yeah, that's interesting. That kind of tendency to pathologize our experience is something I think about a lot. And yeah, I suppose figuring out when that is useful and when that's not useful is such a when there's so many external things happening in the world that are give us pretty good cause to be anxious or negative emotions, like you're saying. Yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about as well. I guess Nick, following from that, but also more broadly, what do you hope people will take away from your research that might help them think through this current period of disruption, or think through disruption itself?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, a lot of what I do is fairly abstract and probably doesn't have a huge amount of direct benefit to people. I mean, one thing that I do a lot of lately, which we haven't talked about so much, except that last point to do with pathologizing experience, is quite relevant to this, I think. So I do a lot of work at the moment on what I call concept creep. And concept creep, as I define it, is this tendency for us to broaden our definitions of harm. So our tendency to see more and more phenomena as aspects of mental illness, or more and more everyday life adversities, calling them traumas. And I think there's a good side to this. We identify things as being problematic that previously we tolerated. So, for instance, the broadening of the concept of bullying, which has happened over the last 2 or 3 decades. That's good to some extent, because it means we identify bad behavior in organizations, which we previously just put up with as office politics. We identify it and we do something about it. But it also that runs the risk of, I think, making people a little bit more sensitive, to the point of oversensitivity, I think, sometimes. And I think one potential practical benefit of my work on this, maybe this point I just tried to make earlier, that everyday unhappiness is not mental disorder. We shouldn't be pathologizing responses to lockdown, to COVID, to social isolation. We shouldn't be feeling that there's something wrong with us for having those negative feelings. They're not the same as having mental disorder. We should really resist this sort of discourse of pathologizing. I mean, I think you put it best there, that's going on. Now, that's not to minimize the fact that some people will have very significant mental health impacts. Generally, there'll be people who already had significant mental health issues, and it's just triggering or exacerbating existing conditions. But let's not treat that as being what's normal. The reality is that most of us are very resilient. Most of us are putting up with things despite very severe, legitimate fears and concerns and economic consequences and the like. Let's not pathologize that. So maybe that's one small impact of my work. I don't know. I could stretch it and say other things are relevant as well, but that would be, as I say, stretching it.
Sounds like you're being quite humble about your work as well there. I'm sure it affects people more than you realize.
Yeah. I hope so. Look, thanks for that compliment. I think, yeah, you always hope that what you do makes a difference, but you also do have to be humble because, there's so many interesting voices out there. There's so many interesting ideas out there. And a lot of what we do in universities, we I think exaggerate how much impact we have because we're mostly talking in an echo chamber. So to the extent that you get something out there, you communicate to a wider audience like you're doing with Mod TV is a wonderful thing.
Well, we're trying to, I think, we sometimes can't tell, or, it's hard to measure that sometimes with our audience, but I think we're doing our best to, have a range of disciplines and ideas being addressed. So,
hey, Hen, you can say thank you.
This is a lesson for all of us.
There you go.
So, Nick, if people watching today or people who might be watching this interview later on are interested in looking deeper into social psychology and any of the ideas we've touched on from, compliments and tall poppy kind of issues, but also dehumanization, refugee, mental health, etc. Can you suggest any particular readings, resources, or places people could look for that sort of thing?
Look, I think just off the top of my head, if you want to learn about tall poppies, just Google Norman Feather. He's a giant of the field. He's a South Australian social psychologist. He's a real, father figure of the discipline, and you do a lot worse than to just check out what he's written. He's a great human being. In terms of dehumanization, there's a lot of psychology about that recently, and I think maybe to start with, again, this is being not very humble at all, but I've got a story on this in the Conversation website, which we could link to, which is about what's wrong with calling people animals, and refers to some of the literature on how people do often see one another as lesser humans. There's some terrific YouTube videos by an amazing Stanford social psychologist called Jennifer Eberhardt about the impact of dehumanizing perceptions on racial policing in the USA. I would recommend anyone go to YouTube and look up Jennifer Eberhardt. Compliments. Look, there's not a huge amount of great work on compliments out there. I'm sorry to say I can't compliment the psychology of compliments. But look, I think there's lots of good things there. And in terms of sort of refugee well-being, you've also got some terrific figures in the Adelaide region studying that. I'd make a shout out to Martha Augustinos. She's a social psychologist at Adelaide University. And she's done some very important things on racism and unwelcoming attitudes to refugees in, for instance, Talkback Radio. So Martha Augustinos is someone worth looking into as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. They are great recommendations. And I feel like we could talk for so much longer because you've triggered so many thoughts. But unfortunately, that's the end of this segment. Thank you so much for your time and your generosity and for covering so many topics with us this afternoon, Nick.
I've really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for interviewing me, both of you. Cheers.
Thank you.